Roger Rose, and this morning we're going to be talking about capital, the pleasure principle, decompression, and friendship. This is section 5.7b of Belonging Again 2.1. And this book was finished up recently, but it's amazing how you keep adding. But I was so inspired by Cadell's presentation yesterday with the Month of Libido, which is occurring at Philosophy Portal. I think it's an extremely innovative structure. I highly suggest that everyone signs up. And I was thinking through what he was talking about with the pleasure principle, and I've been also just thinking about the paper for the Lacan anthology that's coming up, or the conference, and I've been thinking Lacan and friendship quite a bit, and Aristotle's notion of friendship, and how friendship is important for the political system, and what this might have to do with Lacan, what this might have to do with the pleasure principle. And then I also had the complete delight and thrill of speaking with Theory Underground last week, and we talked a bit, and I was listening to their work on capital and by Marx and the logic of capital, and we talked quite a bit on the logic of capital, which in Belonging Again 2, I think we can align with discourse, which basically is the logic of exchange, the logic of capitalism, and so on and so forth. And thinking all of those things together, I couldn't help but write out this section, which I will probably channel into the work on Lacan for the anthology. And also, I think we have to think these things together in order to get a sense of kind of what the stakes are in terms of figuring out friendship, the liminal web. And I think Mikey Downs has done such tremendous work on Nick Land to help show the stakes of how a lot of all of these questions have something to do with the question of dealing with the completion of capital in artificial intelligence. But anyway, to read section 5.7b, as Cadell is taught on during the Month of Libido, January 2024 at Philosophy Portal, we learn from Freud and Lacan that the brain naturally works according to the pleasure principle, which is to say that we naturally make choices relative to what will increase pleasure, the pleasure principle. And what Augustine means when he says bad motivations are impossible seems related. So Augustine makes this point where he's like, hey, there's no such thing as a bad motivation. If you think it's, if you want to murder someone, you think it's good to murder them, etc., so forth. So you can't have such thing as a bad motivation. And that seems to be basically kind of what the pleasure principle suggests, is that there's no such thing. It's very, very difficult to operate not seeking pleasure in some way. Now, this isn't inherently bad, but it does mean we are at risk of having the pleasure principle extend beyond the reality principle, or deconstruct givens without us knowing what to do. So, there's really no purely good or purely bad things like pleasure. It's all about ordering, and that's another point from Augustine. I think you can think Augustine, Lacan, Freud, and all of them together this way. Anyway, from eating food to uncrossing my legs to avoiding anxiety, all of these can be seen as operations of the pleasure principle, which society must check and balance with the reality principle, restrictions given, so on, so that our desire for pleasure doesn't lead to profound problems. Say everyone has sex freely and there are countless orphans, everyone consumes and never works, so the society falls apart, and so on. Critically, we find pleasure in the act of understanding itself. It is more pleasurable to understand than not, which is a reason why we avoid lack and anxiety, cutting ourselves off from childhood. And by childhood, I mean the Nietzschean child. If we don't face anxiety, we can't become Nietzschean children. And also it means we enjoy the act of compression the brain naturally carries out so that we can understand the world around us. When I look at a bookcase, I don't experience its fullness, only a compressed image of it as necessary so that I can understand it. Otherwise, I might lose my mind and find myself unable to function. So to think is to compress. Like if you have to compress the world around you into similar, flatter versions of themselves. You could even say almost like simulations of themselves so that you understand it. If you didn't, you wouldn't understand anything. I don't really experience the fullness of that bookcase right there. I experience kind of a notion, a phenomenon of it. That doesn't mean it's separate from the noumenal, if we use some Kantian language in the Hegelian critique, but it does mean that it's not the fullness. I couldn't fathom it if I could. Anyway. Compression is pleasurable, as is belief, according to C.S. Peirce, and yet this suggests we are vulnerable to reductionism because we enjoy it, which is to say we might engage in a reductionism that leads us to the meaning crisis because we enjoy the road along the way. Also, Freud and Lacan are adamant that our brains are not unsexed or neutered, capable of rational thought independent of other bodily functions. The brain is sexed, which means it is not just rational, no matter how much it might think of itself as autonomously rational, which, though it is capable of doing, causes all kinds of problems. But instead, it is a mixture of the rational and non-rational, or the true and the rational. So that is some of the language I like to use, which is to say rationality and desire, which means that what we define as rational is naturally sexed and trained according to desire, no matter how much we might think otherwise. So what's that saying is, for Lacan, the brain is always mixed with libido, energy, sex, pleasure. You don't get a brain that can think objectively without pleasure. There's always some sort of pleasure and desire mixed in. So this kind of enlightenment brain that's autonomously rational and dispassionate doesn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be more objective than less. That doesn't mean your thinking must be slaved by pleasure. But it does mean it probably will naturally be such. And also, we can't think completely independent of pleasure. That's not possible, but that's not inherently bad if there's a way to order pleasure in a manner that, say, leads us toward childhood or depth. There seems to be, I brought this up with Mikey, I brought this up with Dave and Nance, is that there seems to be a difference almost between pleasure and depth. The depth of pleasure and just kind of the consumeristic pleasure that is so flattening and problematic. Anyway, to resume. Ultimately, then, under the pleasure principle, what we happen to define as rational will be according to what increases pleasure. But if there's a point where pleasure can prove destructive, this means our very rationality could be part of the problem, leading us towards self-effacement. This being the case, we should not assume that just because we act rationally, we therefore act best. Rational and best are not similes, which is to say that pleasurable acts of compression might lead to trouble. Understanding is pleasurable, which for one suggests why it is possible that talking could be pleasurable like sex, as Lacan famously suggested on intercourse, conversation being as pleasurable as sex, but also suggests that the pleasure principle could direct us toward making the world understandable. This is a good thing, yes? Well, assuming we don't overfit our tendency to compress, which is to say we don't compress too much, like enjoying too much, or in the wrong way. But this brings us to capital, and why perhaps we have taken capital too far. So now we're talking about Marx. As we learned from Marx, capital compresses everything into prices and numbers, which for one is why operations between very diverse people under pluralism is possible, the power of systems versus negotiations, which is discussed earlier in the book. And in fact, systems of the market have a very useful function in communicating important information quickly. I frankly don't always need to know the whole story behind a wrench in a store. I just need to know the price. Pricing and capital compress information just like the brain does, which is one of the reasons they seem to work so well. They match the form and operations of the brain, which the brain is willing to participate in, precisely because understanding is pleasurable and compression can make things understandable, ergo pleasant. I'm not surrounded by so much anxiety. The world feels more intelligible. So the move here is the idea that capital makes things understandable because they're prices, and I get a sense of their quote-unquote value, which is, of course, I think a false value, but it makes me feel like I understand things around us. Understanding is pleasurable, and so capital is pleasurable in making the world understanding. And so capital in that way is part of the pleasure principle. So that's kind of the argument, that compression is pleasurable because it creates understanding, and understanding is pleasurable. And that would be based on like the work of a C.S. Paris with ethics of belief and so on and so forth. And I think it's true. It's more pleasurable to understand than not. Not understanding can be tormenting. So I think, so the key is kind of pleasure, compression, capital. They all together, but let's resume. Indeed, the pricing mechanism described by Hayek increases intelligibility across numerous people of great diversity effectively, and it makes possible the coordination of resources that otherwise seems impossible to manage. Again, the society becomes so much more intelligible that profound coordination becomes possible, and that's, the coordination problem of von Mison's. But here is where the trouble can start. So, Hayek has extremely good arguments for the value of the coordination of the pricing mechanism. I think Tyler Cohn recently said that the use of knowledge by society, whatever the paper's name is like the greatest econ paper of all time, because it makes clear kind of the business of economics, and I think there's a lot of truth to this. So no one is arguing the pricing mechanism doesn't work or that it's not miraculous, really. But now we have to kind of start about where some trouble might start. So, to resume, we love pleasure. And as we learn from James K. Smith, we are what we love, which is to say our habits form around our loves, which in The Fate of Beauty will be important to understand for why beauty can shape character. So James K. Smith in his book, You Are What You Love, argues that what we love works on our habits, and our habits form our character. So what we love kind of directly leads to our character and forming habits. And if we love understanding, if we enjoy understanding, then we can love understanding and thus form habits around understanding, and thus that's going to create our character. So that's kind of the line of cause and effect. Okay, so understanding is pleasurable, which means compression can form habits, and so we can be trained by capital into habits of treating things in the world as compressed, so much so that we get out of the habit of being capable to decompress them back into their fuller state. And at this point, temporary compression becomes flattening, as Marx warns about, because capital trains us through our pleasure principle to make the world understandable for the sake of economic functionality and productivity, only for us to eventually get in the habit, due to pleasure love of understanding versus suffering anxiety, of treating things as compressed to the point where we forget that we are treating things as compressed, and so we believe the compressed version is the full version, because we forget that an alternative version is possible. And if we lose through habit formation the capacity to decompress, then in a real sense the compression versions becomes the full versions. This arguably is a key problem with capital, which is when discourse prevails. In the language of discourse versus rhetoric is throughout, belonging again to. I also talk about it with Guy for those who are interested. Basically discourse, and we're also using that language because I think it's true that language, the discourse structures the subject, as people like Foucault and I guess Frankfurt and them talk about. But I don't think, but the problem, of course, as Russell was saying with Cadell, if the subject is structured by language, then there's no possibility of freedom, where if there's kind of a lack in Zizek, there's a possibility of freedom. But I would also note that, we actually have the possibility of freedom because discourse doesn't have to be the only discourse. There is also rhetoric, as described by Dietrich Maclowski, which is precisely not entropic, but negotropic, because it is an attunement integration with lack. The apophatic opening, stuff like Stanley Rosen's nihilism that I talked with Guy, the lack, etc., etc., etc. And, so rhetoric is the conversation that structures the subject to be according to the character that is negentropic, not entropic, because it is orbiting lack in nihilism, which we've also talked with the Lithuania Free Market Institution about. And so it is possible to structure yes, the subject is structured by language, the subconscious is structured by language, as we learn in Lacan, but there are different kinds of quote-unquote languages. We have discourse versus rhetoric here, so those are kind of the key principles, but much more can be said, but I bring those out with Guy, and the book is a lot about those. And discourse we can also associate with Kafka, which I've talked with Pei about, and how our consciousness structures ourselves toward our oppression. And rhetoric, which is Dietrich Maclowski, that seems to be the source of creativity, childhood, the great enrichment, intrinsic motivation, etc., etc., etc. To resume, if it was possible to operate within capital discourse without this habit formation occurring, which turned compression into more permanent flattening, we might achieve a negation sublation of capitalism out of true history into absolute history, for this would be for us to successfully spread anxiety-facing childhood. Those whom the pleasure principle didn't control, but who instead mastered their own pleasure principle. So here with absolute history, it's Hegel. The truth is everything that is the case. Following Wittgenstein, the absolute is everything that's the case with us, and the idea of the book is going to be saying that we have to negate sublate true history into absolute history, or else basically we're going to suffer the mass equilibria of AI, artificial intelligence. And so it's so Nick Land presents us with the great challenge, the great question. Can we spread childhood or not? If not, we're probably going to end up in the future that Nick Land predicts, which is the end of true history with the true in parentheses. So what this paragraph has been arguing is that capital trains us to form habits of compressing. And this is because we enjoy compressing. But in that, we lose the habits of decompressing, which is restoring things to their fullness. And so treating value as distinct from price, treating things as more than their price, okay? So then there's a distinction here between compressing and flattening. And when we get into habits of compressing and lose the ability to decompress, then a temporary compression can become a more permanent flattening, at which point we're stuck in the logic of capital. And that's what I think Marx shows us. And, we can use James K. Smith and Marx together to show how a temporary act of compression, when linked up with capitalism, can turn into a permanent flattening that makes us all into cartoon characters, as I was speaking with Dave and Nancy the other day about. There's, of course, an irony in this, because the reason, we engage in this compression is because of pleasure, and yet, as this is going to get into in a minute, that very act leads us to a place where pleasure becomes flat and dies. So there's some irony there. But to resume, if compression via pricing and capital was a temporary measure, like a zip file, an example would suggest the relevance of Alex Ebert's freak theory for what we are discussing. And this whole section could absolutely be overlaid with Ebert's freak theory, where he talks about compression and extremely valuable theory, and that's completely in operation here. And it has Hegelian influence, and I think Hegel is going on here, so on and so on. To resume, that would be one thing. But if compression via pricing and capital was a temporary measure, that would be one thing. But the problem is that the pleasure principle makes it very hard for us to make sure such compression is temporary. It is just too enjoyable to understand things, which though makes possible philosophy as pleasure, as we will actually need for the spread of friendship. Please note, just sublimated, also puts us at risk of being controlled by capital. For good reason, quote unquote. And please note, the pleasure of understanding is also a reason why philosophy is always at risk of becoming tyrannical and auto-cannibalistic, as David Hume warns on. So the very pleasure of philosophy is what can drive us into the quote unquote heroic ascent that turns us into tyrants, as I've discussed with David Hume. To resume, capital naturally overfits the pleasure found in understanding to all things via compression, which trains us into habits by which we get out of practice of decompressing entities or facing things in their fullness. If there are no social institutions like families or churches to say help us remember not to overfit compression, say in reminding us that we don't know everything, or that there is an infinite God out there and perhaps within our neighbors, then the likelihood that temporary compression becomes permanent flattening is very high, at which point we will suffer pathologies and self-effacement. Worse yet, if social practices train us in the opposite direction, which is to say, if they train us further into habits of compression like capital does, then we will have an entire socioeconomic and political order which trains people into habits that lead to a dehumanizing and pathological flattening. And I would argue that our technological society does indeed train us to compress even further, in addition to how capital trains us, for everyone now seems to be an image on a screen, a performance, a platform, so on. As Marx warned that capital turned people into personifications, so technology can do the same. The technological essence Heidegger warned about is an extension of the logic of capital. And I definitely think that what Heidegger is saying with technology is very much aligned with capital, even though Heidegger himself may not have thought much of Marx, I'm not sure. But the part of the problem is we've read Marx according to the labor theory of value versus the value form theory. And I agree with Nance and Dave that the value form is better. Now, whether or not Marx himself followed the value form, I think he did. Heinrich, they've been reading Dr. Heinrich, who's amazing. And that's an argument, right? But I think the value form, let's put it this way, you need the value form reading of Marx in order to align him with regaining leisure, Dave's time energy, which is necessary for the gaining of childhood, without which we fall into the Nash equilibrium of artificial intelligence as outlined by Nick Land. So I think that reading of Marx is, right or wrong, and I do think it's right, but let's say it's not. Even if it's not, I think it is more useful for our purposes in helping us think the absolute choice. To resume, capital works because it channels the pleasure principle into making the world more understandable through compression. But precisely because that understanding is enjoyable and lovable, we can form habits that threaten our very humanity, because humanity requires facing fullness, which is facing anxiety and not understanding. The logic of capital is the logic of compression, which is discourse, and AA, for there is no otherness, B, to pass into, as Hegel would discuss, that is compressed away, per se. And this logic tends to become autonomous precisely because of the habits which the logic forms. Please note, though, that if it didn't become autonomous, the logic of capital would arguably be just fine and very useful. The problem is that it is not naturally dialectical into training us into habits out of dialectical. The problem is that it is not naturally dialectical in training us into habits out of dialectical thinking, precisely due to the pleasure principle. So again, if capital, didn't become autonomous and train us into AA, it could be very fine. It could be a very useful tool. Capitalism, it has the pricing mechanism which solves the coordination problem. That's a really big deal. But the problem is that our solution to the pricing mechanism seems to train us out of the AB, the humanity we require to keep capitalism from losing demand and falling into a great stagnation. And, but at the same time, it seems the answer to this is ultimately a human element, not a system element. And if that's the case, then we need to ask, how do we spread the conditions of that human element? But to resume, ultimately, the negation sublation of true history into absolute history is basically a matter of learning to live with capitalism without absorbing the habits of capitalism, which is when capital discourse dominate and we suffer self-effacement. So again, it would seem that the spread of childhood, like this book has tried to make the argument that spreading the conditions of childhood is seemingly what we need to focus on. And if we were to do that, that would enable us to live under capitalism without being formed by capital. Which then, of course, would probably lead to changes in the system, but you would have the inner logic then lead to that transformation. And I think that's an important difference. To resume, this is for us to be children, for we learn to use AA as a tool versus a totalizing worldview that never comes to replace AB. This is very hard to do, though, precisely because our pleasure principle will enjoy replacing AB with AA if we let it. Stopping this from happening, though, requires lifelong training and practices, which suggests a need for new communities and even new religious thinking, a major concern of the liminal web. And the liminal web seems to be part of this conversation. I am against anything autonomous, for that is AA and self-effacing, and it is unfortunately natural for capitalism to train us into habits of compression which result in us enjoying a flattening of the world until one day we find ourselves unable to unflatten or decompress the world and at the same time find everything flat and meaningless. Because of the pleasure principle in concert with capital, we find ourselves enjoying a training into a world where everything is more permanently flat, and by the time we realize it, we've lost the abilities through habit formation to escape. A terrible victory of irony, for we compress the world in the name of pleasure, which led to a flat world where pleasure is flat. What we did for pleasure is why we lose capacities for pleasure. The pleasure principle's victory is boredom, a point on which we might see why wealth and the great enrichment could to a degree cause boredom without being the direct cause, and that's a conversation between Dr. Patricia Sachs and Dietrich Miklowski that's entertained in the book. The great enrichment leads to capital, and capital trains the pleasure principle to lose habits of decompression, without which all pleasure eventually feels flat and empty. This formation of bad habits could happen to the rich and poor alike, for the rich and poor are all under the logic of capital, ergo discourse. It is very probable that the logic of capital comes to be autonomous AA, which means it becomes self-effacing versus a useful tool, precisely because capital works so well and so much like the brain, which naturally operates according to the pleasure principle. For it is unnatural to sublate pleasure into something more like the depth found in children, which though is necessary for absolute history. So, we talked with Dave and Nance about you could perhaps say a difference between pleasure and depth. To resume, in compression, we gain the pleasure of understanding, but the problem with this pleasure is that it can be at the expense of the thing we understand, precisely because we leave behind their fullness, as we ironically and tragically must to some degree. Fullness is also terrifying because it is an unknown, and we make a distinction, O.G. Rose, between unknowable and unknown, which can prove a source of both Lovecraft and Dante. In their fullness, people entail dimensions we cannot access, which if openings and lacks instead of nothingness means something might emerge we cannot predict or plan for, which might reduce us to ass. All we can do is be prepared for the unknown, but capital naturally trains us out of the habits needed so that we might be so prepared. And so we atomize and separate. It's only rational, ergo pleasurable. And this book makes a distinction between plan and prepare, which we also talk about at Parallax with Cadell if you're interested. Perhaps we might say the noumenon is like reality, the reality principle that in Kantianism we deal with by saying it is inaccessible, thus giving the pleasure principle free rein. Phenomenon are perhaps a product, and please note I say Kantianism versus Kant because I'm increasingly convinced that the Kant is more sophisticated than the crude Kantianism we were used to, but has had a real effect in history, so we can meaningfully talk about it. But anyway, phenomenon are perhaps a product of pleasure rationality, and if all we can ever access are phenomenon, all we should ever worry about is enjoying ourselves. It's not our fault we can't cross the noumenon, after all. But if Hegel is right that the noumenon is and part of the phenomenal realm, then the reality principle is part of the pleasure principle, and if the pleasure principle thus totally overcomes and tries to even destroy the reality principle, pleasure will destroy itself, which is perhaps exactly what boredom is, the suicide of the pleasure principle as perhaps aided by capital. Flattening follows from a hard noumenal and phenomenal split, AA, but compression does not have to lead to this if we can keep them together as noumenal phenomenal, AB, which is not easy though, for AB is much harder to understand than AA, and the pleasure principle enjoys understanding. To keep capital from becoming autonomous, AA, we must be capable of compression and decompression, AB, which means we do not let our pleasure principle master us versus we master sublimate it, which I would note is good for capitalism, for this is how we keep alive rhetoric over discourse, and so can create demand versus just stimulate demand. And a big point of this book is that economics has not really asked what is demand. We've conflated the categories of stimulate demand and create demand, and this has led us to, basically, that's led to all sorts of trouble, because now we have the great stagnation, falling birth rates, all this other stuff, because all we can do is stimulate demand, which basically means we just have to, stimulate the pleasure principle, and eventually the pleasure principle eats itself, and so we're screwed. So it's really important that we ask what is demand, and we have to be able to create demand, which is rhetoric. And I think basically Dietrich McCloskey with The Great Enrichment is showing the power of demand if you know how to create it in rhetoric, but unfortunately rhetoric is naturally replaced by discourse when the pleasure principle takes over, and does so through understanding, ergo capital, which turns compression into a permanent flattening. This all suggests the distinction between thinking and perceiving brought up in Reconstructing A as A, and basically all thinking compresses. A word, a thought, a notion, all of these compress so that we might understand and live in an intelligible universe, which doesn't reduce us to ash, which is a Lovecraft-Dantean reference. This is not the problem, and in fact we require AA for AB to be possible. The problem is when we get into habits that make us compression and incapable of decompressing. This is the issue of capital. Though theoretically if capital didn't form these habits, it could be a remarkable tool. Unfortunately, we make our tools and then our tools make us, but also fortunately if spreading childhood and spreading net tradition are somehow connected, or cipher tradition, I keep going back and forth on the language, and I've spoken with Layman Pascal about that, and Guy. To resume, for compression not to become flattening, we must sublimate. And boy, howdy do I struggle to say sublimate versus sublate and... Anyway, we must sublimate pleasure into a difficulty in childhood that keeps us in AB, which means we overcame the logic loves habits of capital that is culminating in artificial intelligence, for AI is the Nash equilibria, which follows when everyone is autonomously rational according to the pleasure principle as trained by capital. To spread childhood is to spread the conditions in which compression does not become flattening, which is to say we spread the conditions in which different habits following AB might form, which means we spread the conditions in which different loves might arise. Much comes down to love, and thus much will come down to regaining the possibility of friendship, which we will not prove able to keep or maintain without understanding forgiveness, hence our reflection on the sunflower. Earlier in the book, we talk a lot about the question of forgiveness in the sunflower, which is an extraordinary text. To resume, philosophy can train us to be capable of decompression with the DE in parentheses, both compression and decompression AB, but seemingly only to the degree philosophy stays in the real and doesn't become abstract and divided from common life, as Hume warns about, which is also arguably when rationality as a mental illness becomes the case, as Matthew Stanley discusses, episode O.G. Rose Conversation 125. Rationality is always potentially such and is at the end of true history. So Matthew made this wonderful point where, rationality almost seems to be a mental illness, and I really agree with that. And I think it is if it gets stuck in flattening, which it naturally tends to. So, it's a mental illness. It's a symptom we might be able to use in service of childhood, but not naturally. It will take work and choice and cultivation and so on. To resume, this is why philosophy needs friendship, I think. But it is to keep philosophy concrete. But it is also the case that friendship needs philosophy. When they are together, we learn to enjoy decompression in the unknown, which can train us by loves into habits that we employ wherever we go, even amid capital. So friendships, is coming into focus here is really important. Friendship is the realm in which we learn to enjoy decompression, which is to say encountering the ever-growing fullness of the other as possible because of the existence of interiors, perhaps possible after writing, but we also need compression to engage in this enjoyment, for none of us can handle the whole fullness of the other all at once. We can hardly handle our own fullness, hence why we need to be able to compress ourselves to ourselves, which means that we must be at risk of self-deception to live fully, as we must be at risk of AA to prove capable of AB. So the idea here is that Guy with Dr. Anton was talking about how the interiority of the subject seems to almost arise with writing. In an oral tradition. There was hardly any difference between feeling angry and acting angry. After writing, there's this kind of ability to hide what you feel, which means there can be a break between feeling angry and acting angry. But with that, there is the very development of an interiority of the other, which is the source of the real, or the dusting, could be the dusting, as Dr. Boothby was describing, which again comes with writing. So everyone has a certain fullness thanks to that interiority that can be experienced, but also, if writing indeed gave us that interiority, it also gave us the ability to hide it, which almost seems fitting because no one can handle it all at once, even ourselves. So we have to be able to regulate it or to ventilate it or express some of it at one time versus others. And, friendship is the realm where we learn those skills, basically. When to compress, when to decompress, when to hide, when to conceal, so on and so forth. And it also should just follow that variability we gain perhaps with writing is also what makes self-deception possible, because we can hide ourselves from ourselves, but we also have to if we're not going to be destroyed by ourselves. And what I mean by that, I'll bring in Dante here to resume. Where there is decompression, with the D in parentheses, we learn to think in a manner that suggests the movement of Dante and God's hiddenness, which is necessary so that a process in which we gradually come to be able to handle more of God becomes possible. The movement of decompression, D in parentheses, is what Virgil and Beatrice guide Dante through, and this is what philosophical friends are to likewise guide one another through. Capital, in this way, is the force opposite of Beatrice. But as Dante had to work through Inferno and Purgatorio on his way to the Paradiso, so we must walk through capital and anxiety. To avoid them is for there to be no journey, only boredom and self-effacement. Where we look at the sun directly, we can go blind. But where the sun is completely gone, there is darkness. Both of these are autonomous mistakes of AA, which suggest that B must metaphorically be a cloud which conceals the sun so that we might look at it, gradually moving aside as our eyes adjust so that we are not burned and yet able to see more of the light. If the cloud doesn't move, though, it is AA, and so there must be motion and development. A friend process, which is an emphasis in thought today. A friend like this is an absolute friend per se, and perhaps no other friend is ultimately possible or sustainable. Hard to say, but this suggests that friends are those who help us think beyond capital and discourse. And if friends stuck in a logic of exchange capital discourse are friendships which will ultimately fail to prove problematic, then it does not seem wrong to say that philosophical friends are the only friends, but I don't want to overstep. Friends are like Beatrice to one another, for friends know we are like Dante. Friendship is what trains us out of habits of compression by teaching us to love people in their fullness versus love and understanding trained by capital, which leads to compression and then inescapable flattening once we forget how to decompress in losing the habit and ability for its possibility. Philosophical friendship is a common space in which people are trained to maintain the capacity to decompress, D in parentheses, which means they stay dialectical and childlike. Though it will have to be elaborated on throughout Belonging Again Part 2, without decompression and hence D in parentheses, and hence friendship, we might find that democracy, capitalism, and the like are not possible. We cannot sublate true history into absolute history without friends. A lot more needs to be said on friendship and its connection with Lacan. That's what I'm thinking about doing the paper on. But I will wait until later in Belonging Again. But we can glimpse here why the question of commons is tied to the question of philosophical friendship and the possibility of training an alternative logic, AB, to the logic of capital, which requires childhood, which means spreading childhood has something to do with spreading the commons, which will bring us to the work of the incredible Michelle Bowens, who I've had the complete delight of speaking with. Capitalism without the logic of capital as autonomous is capitalism, with rhetoric and childhood, which seems to be the conditions which cause the great enrichment, McCloskey. But this condition does not naturally last. Capitalism is unstable, as we learn from Keynes. And if we want to make a distinction here between capitalism and capital, which I cannot promise I will ever use again, we could say that capitalism naturally devolves into capital because of the very pricing mechanisms capitalism employs thanks to rhetoric. These mechanisms then naturally generate habits of compression because the pleasure principle likes compression understanding, which can train us into inescapable flattening, which then effaces the very rhetoric that made capitalism enriching. Rhetoric is hence flattened into discourse and capitalism becomes mere capital. In this way, we see how capitalism is unstable and naturally becomes capital, a compressed version of itself to suggest some wordplay, which would mean that spreading childhood would be to keep unstable capitalism from self-effacing into capital, which leads to AI and land. Nickland. If there was no other way, though, to deal with the knowledge problem, hike, or the coordination problem, Mises, without pricing mechanisms, which are habitually very dangerous, this would mean spreading childhood could be our only hope, for absolute history is a matter of keeping capitalism from becoming capital like it naturally does, and as our pleasure principle would naturally enjoy, until we find ourselves like rats in utopia. A little fable, Kafkaesque. The exit is facing no exit. For more by O.G. Rose, please see O.G. Rose, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. Please visit Theory Underground, Philosophy Portal. They were very inspirational here. And also check out the work of Michelle Bowens. And thank you so much for your time.